Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Manuela Moschella about her book titled Unexpected Revolutionaries: How Central Banks Made and Unmade Economic Orthodoxy, published by Cornell University Press in 2024, which investigates the transformation of central banks roughly from the 1970s to the present. Because as she points out in the book and is going to be telling us about, central banks kind of have this image of being very uptight, very conservative, very politically neutral in a lot of ways. And yet, in recent times, stuff's happened where they've had to change their usual practice and some unusual things have actually taken place. What is actually going on with that? How should we understand that transformation and the processes within it, what has enabled it to happen? There's quite a lot, really, that is worth getting into, and thankfully we have a book that does it. So, Manuela, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about your book.
Thanks, Miranda, for having me. My pleasure.
Could you start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and explain why you decided to write this book?
Oh, absolutely, Miranda. Thanks. So I'm a scholar in international political economy at the University of Bologna, Italy. And, I'm a scholar of financial crisis, economic institutions, and economic policies in general. And, these are usually topics that my family and friends do not really engage with. It's not the first topic of a conversation. But then suddenly, around 2014, 2015, it happened to me to realize that family and friends were suddenly interested in some of these economic institutions, and in particular central banks, especially here in Europe. We were still grappling with the legacy of the banking crisis after the 2008 financial crisis. And, my parents, my friends were asking me questions about why the ECB didn't raise rates as yet, what's going to happen to my saving. And so I realized that, institutions that were usually somehow boring or not particularly visible has completely changed and become much more central to everybody's economic life, much more visible. They've always been central to economic life, but they become much more visible. And so I thought, oh, there is a story to be told here because, people now get it, what's going on. And that's how I got interested in digging deeper into the workings of these particular institutions as central banks are.
That definitely makes sense as kind of piquing your interest. Hang on, something's here, right?
Yeah.
To investigate further. But of course, we all know that starting with, I want to go look into something, isn't kind of where we end up with a book, right? There's a whole process of going from that initial interest into figuring out specific questions to research and answer. So can you tell us more what questions you ended up asking in the book and how you developed them?
Yes, I started off from this interest in central banks. And the more I looked into that, the more I thought that I had to go deeper and to go historically back in time. And so the questions that I really ask in my book, as you kindly said in your presentation, Miranda, is really about the transformation of central banks and to try to make sense of why these institutions have become so different if we compare them to the 1980s to what they look like today. So really the question that I address in the book is really how this institutional transformation of central banks has come about. And the transformations and this revolution that is in the title, what points at is the fact that after the great inflation of the 1970s and the 1980s, central banks have come to take on themselves a particular shape. And this is the shape of an independent institution whose first goal is that to maintain price stability as the best contribution to economic growth. So there was really a shrinking of the role of central banks towards the price stability mandate. So a good central bank came to be an independent institution whose first goal was that to maintain inflation, even if that meant giving less weight to the goal of achieving employment, which was, the mantra after the Second World War. So going back in time, after the Second World War, there was more of a balance and more attention to employment. But after the experience of the great inflation, which I recall in the book, the idea was that no, central banks had to really focus on one target, that is price stability. And in order to achieve price stability, they should really use basically one instrument, which was the interest rate, which was meant to be an horizontal measure that applied to all society in a such neutral way. And so this was the image of central bank and the institutional shape of central banks, basically up until the start of the 2008 global financial crisis. But then starting in the 2008 global financial crisis and then in 2020 with the pandemic, central banks have really stretched the shape of this mandate. Because first of all, in terms of tools, they've not just relied on interest rate as the technology through which to ensure macroeconomic stability, because they have used their balance sheet by buying assets of different types, but they've also stretched the goals that they target. So not just price stability, but they've also different points in time brought into the landscape financial stability is a crucial goal, even employment, and even more recently, social goals like social equality and climate change. So I was really interested in understanding how come that institutions that were modeled to be narrow in scope with a clear mandate and a clear instrument to achieve this mandate became such messy, complicated institutions with multiple mandates, with multiple instruments to achieve those mandates. So how did they accept this transformation? How did they go about it? And so this is the questions that I address in the book.
All right, so now that we've laid out the foundation and the questions, let's turn to how you've answered them, starting with your analytical framework.
Yes, the analytical framework, if you allow me, Miranda, to get at my analytical framework, let me start with what I didn't buy in other scholarships' argument about this issue of institutional transformation, because of course, I'm not the only one interested in the evolution of institutions, of economic institutions, or in the evolution of central banks. And to me, when I started the book, I was unsatisfied with some of the explanations out there, and in particular was unsatisfied with two major explanations. On the one hand, there were those explanations that looked at central banks and their institutional trajectory by relying on the narrative of the only game in town. So the idea was that, these institutions were independent. And so, contrary to fiscal authorities, they were able to act in a crisis without the usual constraints that affect politicians. And so they were the ones that really, out of necessity, were able to transform themselves and face, the challenges of their time. And this was one argument. On the other end were those who argued that the institutional transformation of central banks was more the result of ideational change. Central banks had kind of learned the lessons from the 1930s, the Great Depression, which was one of the biggest financial crises in economic history, and became kind of the benchmark when the 2008 global financial crisis started, the benchmark against which to measure the economic damages to domestic societies. And so this kind of literature argued that, central banks had learned the lessons, the mistakes that have been made in the 1930s, and to avoid bigger recessions, they decided to expand their mandate and their instruments. But the more I was looking into the evolution and the trajectory of central banks, I was finding out that both explanations were insufficient to explain this trajectory, because at different point in times, central banks were not just independent; they were looking outside their political environment in which they were operating, and on the other hand, they were acting even when they did not have ideational consensus on what was the best course of action. For instance, on quantitative easing, central banks often acted in the dark, even without the support of the best economic knowledge. So for me, both sets of explanation were quite unsuccessful in fully explaining this institutional evolution of central banks. And so the argument and the analytical framework that I use in the book centers around the role of reputation. And so I basically build from a large literature on reputation that exists in public administration. I start from the work of Daniel Carpenter, for instance, and I adapt them to political economy, basically, because for institutions like central banks, reputational credibility is of paramount importance. So basically, the argument that I try to make in the book is that if we want to understand the institutional trajectory of central banks, we have to understand the reputational risks that central banks have been confronted with, where the risks were coming from, which were the audiences that posed the greatest risks to central banks, and try to see this risk as the driver of the adaptation of central banks over time. So basically, the story that I tell in the book is about, central banks that constructed the reputation in the 1980s and the 1990s, and then had to struggle to adapt the old reputation to new economic circumstances as soon as the 2008 global financial crisis and then the 2020 crisis started. And you have to adjust it to new economic circumstances and new political circumstances, because of course politicians and the public reacted to what central banks were or were not doing. And so it's reputation in my book that drives central banks' action or inaction.
Okay, so this is, I think, worth getting into in more detail, this idea of reputation, given its centrality to what you found. Before we get into, I suppose, what changed, I want to sort of establish the pre-change so that we can understand the transformation that's happening. So how did central banks come to be seen as so reputable, so orthodox before we get to 2008?
Central banks constructed really a reputation, as I say in the book, based on two characteristics. Based on the notion of conservativeness and the notion of neutrality. So, to start with conservativeness, what central banks started doing since the 1980s, which is the period in which also the wave of central bank independence started spreading around the world, central banks started projecting of themselves this image as institutions whose main goal was that of maintaining price stability. And price stability meant for central banks maintaining a reputation for maintaining low inflation. So basically, central banks started projecting themselves as institutions which really cared about maintaining low and stable inflation, where low is the key word. So this law came to be operationalized in several places around the 2% inflation target. So, and that was one part of the reputation. So central banks really came to emphasize this conservativeness, where conservativeness means basically maintaining low inflation. The other plank of central banks' reputation, the reputation that central bank constructed since the 1980s and especially the 1990s, was this idea that central banks were neutral and monetary policy was neutral. This meant that central banks used basically the interest rate as a measure that applies to all society, because when central banks raise or lower interest rates, this is a generalized measure that applies to everybody. It applies to each household, to each firm, to all financial markets. So it applies to everyone. And so by doing so, they were not picking any winners or losers. So they were doing neutral policy making. So they were just doing the best for society. So they were keen on projecting the fact that they were not political. They were just neutral. They were doing what was best for society. They were not picking any winners and losers. And also, by emphasizing the fact that monetary policy could only influence short-term variables and not long-term ones, they were doing, the long-term ones is up to politicians. We are unelected technocrats, we just control the short-term interest rates. And so in doing so, they also emphasized this notion of neutrality. So this was the kind of reputation they emphasized before 2008.
Okay, so this is very helpful to understand as sort of a baseline. But before we get into what happens after 2008, I want to ask you about something that will sound like a tangent when I'm asking, but as I'm sure your answer will prove, very much helps us then move into this post-2008 period. So if we go from, before we get to 2008, let's go back to sort of the 90s, I suppose, the end of the 20th century. What lessons could have been learnt during this period while the central banks were being all orthodox and seemingly neutral? What could they have learnt from what was happening in Japan? And why didn't they integrate any of these lessons?
That's a very interesting point, and it's something that has been on my mind while I was reading the book, because there was such a cautionary tale in this period in what was happening in Japan at that time, uh, because Japan was basically the only high-income country that was experiencing a deflationary period before the period that started in 2008. So Japan was really a preview, if you want, in what many central banks in high-income countries will experience after 2008. But central banks did not learn any lessons, or at least, Japan was not considered so central to gain lesson from central banks around the world. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. So in Japan, at the beginning of the 1990s, there was the usual cycle of a financial crisis. So there was, the great moment in which everything was going fine, and then there was the crash. And after the crash, at the beginning of the 90s, after the failure of many financial institutions, economic activity stagnated, there was a surge in unemployment, and it really lasted for a while. It was the so-called lost decade. How did the central bank react? The Bank of Japan? The Bank of Japan, of course, the first line of defense was that of lowering interest rates. But Japan is an interesting case because, as I was saying, it was the only central bank that before in high-income countries that in this period met the deflationary environment of the so-called, the saying that central bank risk pushing on a string, because once they lower interest rates and interest rates reach the zero lower bound, so they reach basically zero, the central banks had to use other tools to stimulate the economy because they could no longer use the interest rate below the zero level. So they started experimenting with quantitative easing. What is interesting about Japan for my story is that how, monetary experts, monetary practitioners, in the book I try to recall what were the lessons learned from the Japanese experience. And, what comes out from my overview is that Japan was seen as an outlier. It was seen as an outlier, was seen as the major problem in Japan was the one in that the central bank did not look credible in reflating the economy. And this is interesting because, this is exactly the kind of a reputational trap, because up to that moment, the Central Bank of Japan, like all the other central banks, had committed to low inflation, had committed to maintain inflation low, to deflate the economy mostly. But the moment in which they had to switch and to move from deflating to reflating the economy, they faced a credibility problem in reverse, because now the public did no longer believe that the central bank could switch a reputation from being an inflation fighter to be an inflation creator. Because this is what happens in a deflationary environment. You have to create inflation, you have to initiate economic activity, you have to create the conditions for economic activity. So basically what happened, that was a preview of times to come, that the Central Bank of Japan, because of its reputation and the reputation that he had built in the past, the reputation to commit to low inflation, the moment in which the problem was no longer low inflation, but to create higher inflation, find itself in this reputational trap, that it was very difficult to convince the public that now the central bank could commit to higher inflation and so stimulate economic activity. And this is one of the reasons why the central bank had trouble getting Japan out of the lost decade for such a long time.
Okay, so this is very good to know because obviously once 2008 hits, there's a lot of challenges to the way central banks are used to doing things, that orthodoxy that you described for us earlier. Can we be specific though, although I think probably a lot of us have memories of that time, from a much more research and analytical point of view, what were these challenges that central banks were facing after 2008?
The challenges can be put in a very simple way, that the scenario changed from a scenario in which central banks had to maintain low inflation to a scenario in which central banks had to combat deflation, where prices were going down and economic activity stagnated, and we were in a recessionary context. So, in this recessionary context, basically what a central bank should do is to stimulate economic activity. And so, the first line of defense for a central bank is, of course, to lower interest rates. You lower interest rates and you make money cheaper, and by doing that, you try to stimulate economic activity. But this could not work. This is what happened during the worst of the global financial crisis. And so central banks had to find new ways to stimulate economic activity. And so they turned into the playbook that the Bank of Japan and other emerging market countries had experienced with in the past. So they were trying new ways. One of those things was to use the balance sheet. And so to buy assets of different kinds, private assets, public assets, by doing so, trying to really stimulate economic activity. But it was, an imperfect tool as compared to their reputation. It was an uncomfortable situation for central banks because, as I was saying, imagine you are somebody that for 30 years have been telling the world that you care about low inflation, and you care about low inflation by creating this neutral environment that is fair to everyone. And then suddenly you are telling, you know what? I'm no longer interested in maintaining low inflation, but I have to create high inflation. And for doing that, I have to pick winners and losers. I have to decide which are the assets I have to buy and which are the people who are going to gain the most. And so central banks found themselves in these very uncomfortable situations because as the economic conditions change, they have to really somehow renege on the image, on the public image, on their reputation, on this public posturing that they've been building for 3 decades. And so they have to find a way to navigate this very complicated environment. In the book, I cite economist Paul Krugman that describes this problem for central banks in the case of Japan, because Krugman says this terminology of irresponsibility, that in a deflationary environment, a central bank has to turn irresponsible, where irresponsible in this case means to act against what was supposed to be responsible policymaking in the past. And this responsible policymaking in the past was basically the idea that you have to maintain low and stable inflation. But then suddenly you have to do exactly the opposite. You have not to maintain low inflation, but you have to create high inflation. And this, of course, puts central banks between a hard and a rock place.
Yeah, that's definitely not an easy situation for them to be in, especially now that you've painted it so clearly for us. We've been talking about central banks kind of as a type of institution in plural, but I'd love to, for the next few questions, kind of go into the specifics of particular central banks that are so, well, central to understanding all of these different dynamics and bring in some new actors as well. So obviously the US Fed is the key central bank actor in the United States. But when we're looking at what the Fed is doing or not doing, we're often talking about markets. We're talking about kind of all sorts of things, of inflationary pressures, recessionary pressures, as you've been talking about. You, however, bring in the US Congress as being a really key actor to understand in terms of the relationship between the Fed and Congress. How does looking at this interaction help us understand what the Fed did after 2008?
Thanks, Miranda, for bringing that up, because it also allows me to get into the details of the book. Because the book has two sections, one which is larger, that depicts this international, transnational story of central banks and the rise of central banks' reputation all over the world. And then I pick two central banks to show how this transformation exactly came about post 2008. And one of these two central banks is the US Fed, the other is the European Central Bank. And I picked two very different central banks because the Fed is, of course, first of all, an older institution than the ECB is, but is also a central bank that traditionally has not just been focused on price stability, but as the so-called dual mandate. So in principle, the Fed should be much more attuned to employment consideration, in contrast to the ECB, which is considered usually more of an inflation hawk because its primary mandate is really to fight inflation. Having said that, to get back to your question, yes, the book, since I build on this reputational argument, on this reputational analytical framework, the book revolves around the idea that we have to unpack central banks' audiences. And in the book, it says that usually the primary audience that scholars have investigated when it comes to central banks is financial markets. And obviously so, because, financial markets transmit the monetary policy impulse through the entire economy. But there are other audiences that are particularly relevant to central banks, and these are, of course, the legislators, the politicians that decide about the independence of the central banks, and also the public, the citizens, because also citizens are important, because also monetary policy applies to households. If we don't believe in what central banks' action are, we take our decisions and financial decisions based on expectations of what monetary policy will be. We decide to start a mortgage or not based on interest rates, just to give an obvious example. So in the book, I also delve into this relationship between politicians and the wider public. And as you were saying, I think this is particularly crucial in the case of the Fed, because the Fed is independent, but as compared to the ECB, is less independent because it has a very special and historical relationship with the US Congress. The Congress, at the end of the day, holds the key to the independence and the power of the central bank. There is a famous quote by Ben Bernanke, the former Fed of the US Fed, the former chair of the US Fed, in his memoir, where he said, the Congress made us, but the Congress can also unmade us, but exactly to convey this message that, a central bank, even as powerful as the US Fed is, cannot ignore what politicians in Congress think about. And so in the book, I tell this story of how this relationship with Congress was extremely important to understand the institutional trajectory of what the Fed did and did not do, and how the Fed transformed its mandate over these 2 decades of basically crises. Indeed, I say that a crucial thing for the Fed to act at different moments in time was the coordination with Congress. So for the Fed, it was really important to have the Congress on board, to have the political cover. So the Fed was really reluctant sometimes to go beyond its mandate, because it was really concerned, the central bankers in the Fed were really concerned that by doing something beyond the goal of maintaining price stability could ruin their reputation forever. And so they were prone to fight deflation, and so move away from the older reputation only when Congress were on board. So only when congressmen and congresswomen decided to support the Fed and coordinated their activities. Indeed, I think that one of the crucial examples is the one of the Lehman Brothers collapse. Lehman Brothers is probably the biggest bankruptcy in financial history. And, there are different narratives about why the Fed decided to let Lehman go without helping, Lehman to survive. Because after Lehman, there was the biggest panic in financial markets ever seen. And the story that I tell in the book is that one of the major reasons why policymakers at the Fed, central bankers at the US Fed, decided to let Lehman go was that exactly because they were trapped in their old reputation and Congress was not on board. So they were too keen in supporting their old reputation as inflation fighter and neutral institutions that they were really scared to help Lehman, because they thought that if they were going to help Lehman, they would have been accused of having becoming politicians. And so they would have been accused of deviating from their reputation. And so they let Lehman go exactly like the Bank of Japan before them was unable to get outside the reputational trap. So that the US Fed was caught in its own reputational trap. It could not get out of it because it was too scared of the reputational risk of doing something different than in the past. But the situation changed after Lehman collapsed. After Lehman collapsed, politics changed in Congress. And so Congress started to be more supportive of US Fed action. And so with this background, having the political cover of Congress, the US Fed started to be much more aggressive in the fight to inflation and recession, and to deviate much more in a much more decisive way away from their old reputation.
The Lehman kind of compare and contrast aspect of that makes it particularly clear the impact of the relationship with Congress. But to pick up then on the comparison that you mentioned earlier, obviously, as you said, the book's not just about the US Fed, there's also the European side. Given that the banks have different histories and somewhat different focuses, how much of the factors that you've just described for the Fed, how much of those factors were the same when explaining the change in orthodoxy on the European side?
On the European side, that was interesting to me, and that's the reason why I picked the ECB as, the other case study to contrast and compare the US Fed with. The same factors that I saw in the Fed, I can find it in the case of the ECB too. That is to say, also in the case of the European Central Bank, at critical moments, by which I mean the moments in which the central bank deviated the most from its old reputation and deviated the most by adopting measures that really were at odds with the old reputation, the central bank did it only when they had political support. Of course, political support in Europe took different form than in the case of the United States, because of course Europe, the Eurozone, is a distinct political configuration. The euro is the currency of 20 different countries with 20 fiscal authorities, so it was much more complicated. But even in the case of the European Central Bank, the most transformative measure that the ECB took, transformative of its history, and as compared to its history, the most transformative actions the ECB took were the ones that had political support. For instance, to give one example, in the book, I tell the story of Mario Draghi, whatever I take. Mario Draghi giving this announcement in 2012 when he said that the ECB will preserve the integrity of the Eurozone. And, Mario Draghi is rightly credited for having rescued the Eurozone from disintegrating. But it was not just Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi arrived at that statement only when it was clear that he had political support for that statement, because Germany was on board and the other countries, especially in continental Europe, were on board. But it took too many years, from 2008 to 2012, to arrive at this political support. Also, in terms of the similarities between the Fed and the ECB case, the other big similarity is the relationship with citizens, because in both cases, the negative public reactions to central banks again pushed central banks to move away from their old reputation for the old way of doing things. And again, in the book, I trace the impact of citizens, what they call politicization, of citizens' negative reaction to central banks, by telling the story of how both central banks went social. They embraced social goals like the fight to inequality in the United States and the embrace of the fight to climate change in Europe. So in both cases, politics and society played a role in pushing central banks away from their comfort zone, if you want, into transformative actions that transform their public image and their institutional role.
Given the amount of change that these central banks have gone through, as you said just now, not just in terms of inflationary policy, but linked to these other aspects of politics and society happening as well, do you think that the central banks will go back to the kind of orthodoxy they used to have?
Miranda, this is really the $1 billion questions. And this is really difficult to tell. I tell you where I stand into this debate, because this is an important debate that is going on. Where will central banks, where are they going? And of course, this question has taken a particular orientation since the return of inflation in 2021, 2022, mostly. Because when inflation came back, and it came back with a vengeance, I have to say, in double digits, especially in the United States, but also Europe has its good share of problem, central banks have kind of reverted to the usual script, because of course with inflation as the main economic problem of the day, they came back to the usual work and the usual practice of fighting inflation, of achieving low inflation. And this is where we are still right now, right? We are still fighting inflation, although, probably, we have reached the end of this battle, but we are still there. Does it mean that central banks will get back to the original point? Honestly, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that central banks have changed a lot over the past 2 decades, and also in terms of the embrace of the social goals, the attention or the renewed attention to employment considerations, social equality, climate change will not be easy to disappear from the screen. Also because they've been ingrained in the institutional setup of the central banks, especially in the two central banks that I analyze in the books. These central banks have changed their monetary policy strategies, that is, the policies through which, the policy scripts through which they orient the activity of the central banks. So to me, even though the context has changed and we have returned to the inflationary problem, I don't think that central banks will get back to usual. There is a famous line by Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England, that says that central banks want to be boring. And I don't think that central banks will they have never been boring, but they certainly, even if they wish to be boring again, we are still that far away from that.
Yeah, I think there has been too much change to just revert back as if nothing had happened. That's obviously a key takeaway from the book, but what are some of the other key implications of your findings?
I think there are two major implications of my findings. One is to do about the relationship between independent monetary authorities and fiscal authorities. I think that one of the major takeaways of the book is that there is a special relationship, and a relationship that can work really well between monetary authorities, even if they are independent, and fiscal authorities. So that in critical moments like a financial crisis or deeply recessionary times, central banks can collaborate with fiscal authorities to achieve a better goal. So this is one of the major takeaways when I was saying that Congress and fiscal policymakers in Europe had an important role to play in pushing central banks to deviate from their orthodoxy is an important takeaway, which means that monetary authority and fiscal authorities can play in the same team and not against each other, which was again a mantra of the 1990s, that everybody should work on its own to achieve its best outcome. Here, there is space for collaboration and in a positive way. So this is one of the critical takeaways. The second takeaway that I want to stress is about the relationship between central banks and its audiences. Because as I was saying, central banks, of course, have a special audience in financial markets. But this is not just it. Central banks also have different audiences to deal with, including politicians and public, the citizens. So really one of the main takeaway of the book is that we really have to learn more about the relationship of central banks with these multiple audiences, and to try to understand how central banks navigate among multiple audiences. So when it comes that central bank listen more to citizens and, less to financial markets, or vice versa. But for me, the critical takeaway is that we have to look beyond financial markets, because complex institutions like central banks live also in a political environment. They need political support, and this comes from both politicians and citizens.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an important takeaway, with some key ways in which that could be implemented in further research. And I guess that leads me nicely to my final question. Is this the sort of thing you're going to be working on next? What might you be up to now that this book is done?
After I swear I would not have started a new book after finishing this one, I'm here again thinking about a new book project. No, I change a little bit in the sense that it's still connected. There is, of course, a connection, because one, of course, of the main thread in the book is this idea that we were witnessing over the past decades to this increased monetary interventionism this expansion, this revolution in central banks that has been taking place over the past decades basically amount to an increased form of monetary interventionism, which means that monetary policy intervenes in different sectors of economic activity. And so, building on this idea of interventionism, what I'm trying to understand right now are different forms of interventions, of state interventions in the economy beyond monetary policy. And so I'm interested, for instance, in particular in this debate on industrial policy, and so how, states, especially in Europe, are using industrial policy to intervene in the economy and to direct economic policy towards certain outcomes and not others.
All right, so continuing to ask interesting questions.
Hopefully so.
Well, best of luck with that project. And of course, listeners who are intrigued by all of this can read the book we've been talking about, titled Unexpected Revolutionaries, How Central Banks Made and Unmade Economic Orthodoxy, published by Cornell University Press in 2024. Manuela, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks to you, Miranda.